Welcome, believers, and welcome to another edition of Everything Weird, Nothing Normal, where we talk about all the weirdly wonderful stuff that goes on in the world, and there's lots. So today, I want to talk about a bloke called Lonnie Zamora. Okay, it was a UFO incident in New Mexico in a town called Socorro. A fantastic incident. It's got it all. It's got Project Blue Book got involved, the Army got involved, the FBI got involved. So stay tuned, and I will tell you all about it. Right then, believers, let me tell you the story of Lonnie Zamora. Now, it starts at 5:45 p.m. on the evening of the 24th of April 1964. Police officer Sergeant Lonnie Zamora was speeding down the highway that cut through the sandy terrain of Socorro, New Mexico, in pursuit of another vehicle that was speeding. Speeding cast in front of him, he heard a roar and saw a flame in the sky between half a mile and a mile away. Now, he would further describe the flame as funnel-like, but as he was driving at the time, his full attention was divided between the bizarre landing object and the oncoming road ever rushing towards him. As he was heading towards the scene, he realised that the noise was still audible, that it was a roar as opposed to a blast. Now, a blast would, go kaboom and then die out, but this roar kept going. This noise would last around 10 more seconds and would change from a high pitch to a low pitch. As the object came lower, Zamora approached a steep hill which his vehicle struggled to negotiate. Now, so much so, in fact, that it took the officer 3 attempts to overcome the climb. The noise had now stopped. He would continue on an urgent but leisurely pace for several more seconds. Right, so he's chilled out a little bit and the noise has stopped. He don't know what's going on. He thinks it's an overturned turn. He thinks it's an overturned car. Then he saw a shiny object to the side of the road around 200 yards ahead of him. At first, Zamora believed the object in front was an overturned car. He could see 2 people standing next to it as if examining the vehicle and their surroundings, and they were wearing white overalls. One of the people appeared to notice his approaching vehicle. He didn't notice anything strange at the time other than their size. Now, he would later state, this is in his own words, they were either small adults or large kids. Now, as he continued to approach a little slower now, he began to get the feeling that the car wasn't an overturned car at all. He would later describe it as an O-shaped or like an egg and of whitish aluminium colour. He further noticed a strange marking or insignia on the side of the craft. Now, we will come to this seemingly strange logo later, as it is important. Now, he would radio a quick report to his location and the situation to the dispatch desk. Then he brought the police car to a stop and began to exit the vehicle. Now, he would radio a quick report of his location and situation to the dispatch desk. Then he brought the police car to a stop and began to exit the vehicle. Almost as soon as he had left the car, the roar returned, and at the same time a blue flame shot out of the underside of the craft. So that whoever those little people were, they saw him coming. I reckon they were scared. They've got back in their craft. Now, he first feared an explosion and he flung himself to the ground. He would make his way to the back of his patrol car, all the while keeping the scene in front of him in sight. So he's jumped down, hid behind his car, but he's still looking. The roar began to grow louder and louder, rising in frequency at the same time. Then the object began to rise into the air directly upwards. As it began to ascend, he would once again see the blue flame with the orange tint to it on the underside of the craft. Now, as the craft continued to rise, Zamora could clearly see it was an oval in shape. What's more, he could still clearly see the red-coloured insignia or symbol on the side of the craft. The exterior had the look of something remarkably smooth and there were no visible doors or windows. That's Zamora's statement. There were no visible doors or windows. Now, Zamora began to back away slightly, keeping the car between himself and the rising craft. Then, at around an altitude of 20 feet, the craft stopped its upwards progression and hovered for several seconds. It stood there. Panic began to rise in Zamora. Fearing another auroral sound or even flames, he temporarily covered his face, I would imagine like that. When he looked again, the craft was again moving in a straight line away from him, this time much faster. He would later state, this is his words, that the object was possibly 10 to 15 feet from the ground and it cleared the dynamite shack about 3 feet. It was travelling very fast. It seemed to rise up and take off immediately across country. So that's Zamora's words. Now, coming back to his senses, Zamora rushed back to the car and radioed a message to the operator at the police desk. Neb Lopez, that was his name. He told him to look out the window to see if you can see an object overhead. He kept the rapidly decreasing craft in sight as it moved over the 6 Mile Canyon mountain region, and it was gone. Now, almost as soon as the craft was no longer in view, another police officer who had heard Zamora's radio calls, his name was Sergeant Sam Chavez, arrived at the location. He would comment how his colleague looked as white as a plate. However, by the time he examined the area, he could clearly see some marks that looked like depressions. Now, both Zamora and Chavez would go to investigate the area that was now a burning brush. Smoke was rising from the apparent burning area. However, there were no flames nor any material that appeared to be on fire. So the burning bush has been caught on fire by sheer heat alone. Chavez also spotted what appeared to be 8 distinctive imprints. 4 of the indentations were larger and rectangular, while the remaining 4 were smaller and round in shape. Zamora would later claim he didn't even notice that this egg-shaped object had feet or legs. The incident would take only a matter of hours to reach the press. It would take only days for the previously sleepy town of Socorro to become the centre of attention for the UFO world. UFO researchers and investigators would descend on the area, as would various reporters from such news agencies as the United Press International and Associated Press. So it's really getting out there. Now, furthermore, and this is more important, groups such as APRO, Aerial Phenomenal Research Organisation, and NICAP, National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, would also send teams to the area. Further still, the US Air Force would send representatives of their Project Blue Book to perform an official investigation. Now, one of the first on location was NICAP investigator Ray Stanford. Perhaps because of this, Stanford would appear to have spoken to several corroborating witnesses before the story truly exploded. He would discover a potential witness who happened to be driving through the state at the time of the sighting, and we will come back to them later, as well as unearthing a report made to a television station in Albuquerque, which perhaps begins to help with Zamora's timeline, because at 5:30 p.m. the Albuquerque residents rang to state that an oval object flying a very low altitude and relative slowly for its size was heading towards the town of Socorro. There were also several witnesses who claimed to clearly remembering hearing a loud roar at around the same time that Zamora claimed he heard them. Stanford would also learn from the Socorro police records that 3 separate members of the public had made reports to the dispatch desk of a bright glowing object rising in the sky. These reports would have been received before the incident had received any publicity. So they were saying stuff before Zamora had said stuff, basically. Perhaps one of the most interesting was a report from Al Madera region of New Mexico. And what's more, the FBI would see fit to investigate this one. Now, on the same day as the Zamora incident, a UFO was reported in the region with military aircraft ruled out. The object remained a mystery. Then, 2 days later, on the 26th of April, at just after 1 a.m, a local resident would go out to see what was disturbing his horses. What he witnessed was shaped like a butane tank, that's what he said, landing on the ground nearby. Now, when it eventually took off again, the witness recalled seeing a blue-white flame on the underside of the craft. He would also discover 4 large indentations on the ground, along with several smaller, rounder ones. Now, furthermore, a burnt circular patch of ground clearly marked the landing site for some time afterwards. So that sounds very like Zamora's craft. Maybe they were the same. It seems that way, doesn't it? It was obvious to all officers at the scene that the indentations were freshly made and not a pre-existing mark. Furthermore, they were made as though an object of significant weight had landed in the area at an angle. Although Zamora was the only police officer to witness the actual craft itself, several others, including Chavez, could more than testify to the authenticity of the situation, as well as, in Chavez's case, to Zamora himself, who would claim that his fellow officer was in a dead state of shock. All would claim how the ground in places was still hot and smouldering when they arrived. Even the FBI report would note how there were 4 irregular-shaped smouldering areas at the location Zamora claimed the incident took place. Chavez would also perform an immediate and thorough search of the area. He could find no tyre tracks aside from the one left by Zamora's vehicle, nor were there any other tracks leading to the landing site. Now, before we move on to look at official military investigation, let's go back to the out-of-town tourists we mentioned earlier. Now, they were driving in the Stamford area. The owner of Whiting Brothers Service Station, near to the location of the apparent landing, his name was Opal Grinder, would go on the record as part of the US Air Force's investigation. Now, while he didn't witness the incident himself, he did know of a pair of gentlemen who were passing through the state who did witness it. He would claim that the vehicle had pulled up just after the loud boom. The gentlemen who came to pay for their goods were quipped to Grinder about how low the aircrafts fly around here. And at the time, Grinder uninterestingly replied that a lot of helicopters regularly fly in the area because he didn't know what they were on about. The gentleman would state back that it was a funny-looking helicopter, if that's what it was. Of course, he didn't understand at the time. They had seen this oval craft. Now, follow-up investigation would eventually reveal the mystery men to be Larry Kratzner, who had spoken to Grinder, and his friend Paul Keese. Both were from Iowa, which is where they were returning at the time. Now, the UFO researcher, Ralph DeGrew, would conduct interviews with the two men in 1978. And while he noticed some discrepancies compared to the account of Zamora, and even with each other's statement, after all, it was 14 years ago, there also was some intriguingly close matching offerings. Now, so for example, Kretzner, would state, he said, I saw a cloud of black smoke coming from the ground ahead of them to the right. A round saucer or egg-shaped object ascending vertically from the black smoke. He would claim also that he could see several windows in the side of the objects. Right, the military investigation and cover-up begins. The United States military first officially arrived to interview Zamora on the 25th of April when Army Captain Richard T. Holder, who was at the time the most senior officer, arrived along with the FBI, Arthur Burns. Now, during the course of the interview, Zamora would state he believed that he had witnessed a secret experimental craft. Holder, however, would quickly dismiss this notion. In fact, he would seemingly go out his way to state to the press that the military had no object that would compare to how Zamora described his vehicle. Almost immediately following the interview, in the dark and using flashlights no less, Holder and Burns would make their way to the alleged landing location. They would quickly cordon the area off while taking samples and examining the blackened area of the brush. Why would you turn up in the dark? Why would you do that? Now, look, while there is no proof in this, in his 1968 book Flight for the UFO Science, researcher James E. McDonald would claim that a sample of fused sand was discreetly removed by the military. He would claim that a contact with the Las Vegas Public Health Service, who works as a radiological chemist, was also involved at the Socorro site that evening. During her work on behalf of the US military, she discovered the solid glass-like area right under the landing site. Most of the samples she would take would prove to be sap. However, there were several unidentified and unknown organic materials. So ultimately, he writes, shortly after she finished her work, Air Force personnel came and took all her notes and materials and told her she wasn't to talk about it anymore. They also removed any remaining evidence of the heat-induced sandblast. Interestingly or not, this analysis reports remain classified. So her report, she is not allowed to talk about. Right, okay, now the main investigator for Project Blue Book, whether purposely or not on the part of the Pentagon, would not arrive in Socorro until 4 days after the incident on the 28th of April. He would quickly realise there was an apparent conflict of interest between discovering the truth and the Air Force's angle on the investigation. Zamora and Chavez, according to Hynek, were very anti-Air Force. This largely due to the apparent blunt accusation that the whole incident was a hoax. In fact, Zamora was so angry he initially wouldn't speak to Hynek. It was around this stage that Hynek began to not only suspect that there might be something to the UFO phenomena after all, but that the military and ultimately the Pentagon and the United States government, despite their public rhetoric, were not interested in finding out the truth and even less interested in sharing it with the general public. Now that we can believe, can't we? Perhaps more damning of all, and certainly an indication of Hynek's feelings towards the Air Force's attitude to facts and evidence, he would write in his notes that the Air Force doesn't know what science is. Of the alleged landing at Socorro, Hynek would state, I think this case may be the Rosetta Stone of UFO cases. There's never been a strong case with such unimpeachable a witness. What a thing to say about Zamora. He was so impressed with Zamora that he pretty much changed his whole opinion on the UFO case. The military, which perhaps indicates how sensitive they believe the incident to be, would attempt to offer that what Zamora had seen was merely an experimental governmental craft. However, with clear descriptions in the public domain, there was no known craft available. And besides, Holder had already publicly stated that. Again, in the words of Hynek, the Air Force were in a bit of a spot over the apparent UFO landing at Socorro. And the reason he says that is because it's very hard to dismiss it. Do you think what he saw was a UFO? Do you think what he saw was a government, a government craft? Do you think it's fake? Do you think it's a hoax? Because there are many people who obviously does. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to read you some of, shall we say, the debunkers' theories, and you can make a decision for yourself then. Persistent attempts to write off this case as a hoax, whether through legitimate debate or through other darker influential means, the accusations that the encounter was nothing more than a hoax would continue to surface. However, each accusation has either been refuted or deemed drastically unlikely by those likely to know. So, for example, respected Harvard astronomer David Menzel would propose that Zamora himself was a victim of a hoax. He would claim that several high school students purposely wanted to trick Zamora and so set up a complex prank. Incidentally, when Hynek would suggest to many of the locals he spoke with, it was an idea that this was universally dismissed. In fact, to most who knew Zamora and the general youth of Socorro at the time, now, renowned UFO skeptic Philip Klass would perhaps show his preconceived bias when not once but twice he attempted to debunk Zamora. Initially, he would state that Zamora had witnessed ball lightning. However, this itself was proven to be impossible in the instance. However, instead of looking at the sighting with a more open mind, Klass simply intensified his attack on the main witness. He would state that along with the mayor of Socorro at the time, and Mr. Bursum, Zamora had invented the entire episode as to put Socorro on the map and to attract a tourism to the area. He would even claim that Bursum was the owner of the land where the encounter took place. This was later proven to be entirely false. So what do you think then? What do you think of the Zamora story? Do you think it's real? Do you think it's fake? Now, I believe that Zamora was so fed up with the questions that he actually gave up his job in the end and went to work at a gas station. So this is not a victimless story. So please, look, this is the Zamora story. Like and subscribe if you can, and please follow my videos and get a ding on the subscription so you'll know when I post another one. Thank you very much.